thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're very grateful, of course, for your interest and your time. I would like to introduce you to my fellow speakers, to whom I am also equally grateful for agreeing to participate in this discussion amidst their very busy schedules at the moment. So joining me today is Dr. Tobias Capwell, who's the Curator of Arms and Armour at the Wallace Collection here in London. Beyond his role at the museum, Toby is an author, a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and jouster extraordinaire, if I can say that. When opportunity allows, he can be found engaging in historical reenactments as well. So I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later on if we have time. Also joining me is Red Finer, who is a partner at Peter Finer Fine Antique Arms and Armour, who's just based around the corner from us here in St James's too. My name is Charlie Mackay, and I'm here representing the Weiss Gallery, and we are hosting the Valour exhibition, which is really the basis of this conversation today. So the exhibition itself showcases our old master portraits that feature sitters who are involved in military pursuits alongside period pieces of arms and armour that have been kindly lent by Red and his father Peter. The show is now available to view in person and virtually. So for those who would like to visit the gallery, we are open by appointment Monday to Friday between now and the 18th of December, next Friday when the exhibition closes. We hope that those visitors who are unable to visit the exhibition in person will be able to enjoy a few digital features which we've created especially for the show. And these include an interactive viewing room and virtual tour, as well as a highlight video. All of these are available on our website and also via London Art Week. So over the next 14 minutes or so, we'll be discussing several portraits from a few different perspectives. I'll be talking about the sitters that are depicted and their backstories, whilst Toby and Red will be hopefully guiding us through the arms and armour that are featured, as well as any symbolism that may be included or implied. After this, we'll be also hearing from Toby about his Arms and Armour month at the Wallace Collection, which runs throughout the month of December. And if time allows, at the end, we'll hope to close with a brief Q&A session. To begin with, I think maybe a brief background. So let me just quickly do that. Sorry about that. If we could introduce with a brief background about the exhibition and why we chose the theme of Valour. The genesis of the show stemmed from what's now probably a familiar feeling for all of having to face difficulties of all kinds head on. We have all, regardless of background or situation, faced an unprecedented, unpredictable, and frankly unpleasant year, which has been littered by uncertainties. We thought that these were probably similar thoughts and worries that were faced by historical figures of days gone by who were involved in military activities or those even charged with exploring the great unknown. Portraiture, like other genres, can be highly controlled. They can be idealized, like landscapes, inspirational, like didactic religious scenes, and provoking, like genre pieces. The sitters, facilitated by their artists, usually share their likenesses when they have achieved a notable milestone in their lives. Though this does not depend, this depends also on the intended audience. So a portrait created for reasons of posterity within a family will capture different sentiments to one commissioned to arouse public adoration, for example. Some people may be painted several times also throughout their lives. Their first could be to commemorate their marriage, another later to record a notable achievement at the peak of their careers, and perhaps ultimately to capture themselves in old age, acknowledging their impending mortality perhaps. So the portraits we'll be discussing right now largely serve rather symbolic purposes. Although the three sitters depicted within the portraits we're about to talk about were from different countries and experienced their respective lives during different periods of history. I think a shared theme revolves around an awareness that each sitter's legacy was bigger than themselves. The potentially bountiful and positive butterfly effects from their mortal actions, whether that was exploring the unexplored or reviving a formerly august family's reputation, surely acted as incentives to perform as courageously as possible in their lifetime, or at the very least be shown to be valiant characters in their portraits. So, are we ready to delve into this first painting?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Great. So this first portrait is a very impressive full length that we have in the show, which we at the Weiss Gallery recently re-identified and reattributed after it had been anonymous for at least 100 years. The sitter is a man called Gerard Reinst, who was an influential and successful merchant from Amsterdam. He served as the second ever Governor General of the Dutch East Indies. And the painting was painted by a Flemish artist, Flemish emigre artist who was based in Amsterdam, called Frans Badens. And it would have been painted around the time of the sitter's appointment as the Governor General, which was in 1613. The sitter, Reinst, his progressive ambition for his country's advancement, as well as his own future prosperity, was actually cut short by his own premature death, as we'll discuss in a moment. But it's really people like the sitter here who laid the foundations for companies like the Dutch East India Company, which created huge wealth for the United Provinces. So I should maybe elaborate a bit more about the Dutch East India Company itself. It was an amalgamation of several trading companies which were formed merged together in 1602. The merger was really ratified to reduce internal competition between the cities and also to pool resources to combat the threat of Spanish invasion at the time. And principally, it was focused on sourcing and returning to Europe products that were exclusively available in Asia. So thanks to its large startup capital from the likes of wealthy merchants like Reinst here, the VOC, which is what it's better known as in the Netherlands at least, could buy wares cheaply in bulk and sell them in Europe for huge profits. So Reinst is here portrayed as a member of the Dutch elite and very much emulating the opulent style of noble sitters of previous centuries from international courts. The imposing full-length figures you see here, he's set within a grand hallway, which we think is probably the chambers of East India House, which is in the center of Amsterdam. To the right, on the table, you'll see that there's an elaborate Persian rug on which sits an ornate cabinet, which I hope I pronounced that correctly. Toby, I was just wondering, have you seen similar comparable pieces before? As the Wallace maybe got an example?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing here are two fairly standard military pieces of armor that were manufactured in Milan in huge numbers. Milanese had an enormous export market, and these two pieces of armor are actually quite old. We have good they're already quite old when they appear in this picture for the first time. We have a nice comparable cabinet in Wallace that's slightly more extensively etched and gilt than the one in the portrait, but it's very much the same thing. These helmets technically are defined by this almond shape with the narrow brim. They usually have a little horizontal stalk at the apex, and they have etched and gilt strap work. And usually you have medallions that contain some kind of triumphal military scene or figure like a Roman hero, Mutius Curtius or whatever. It's pretty standard stuff. I mean, nice pieces that proclaim his status as someone involved in the military community in one way or another. And the gorget that he's wearing at his neck, we also have a good, reasonable comparison for that at the Wallace. And again, the Italian, an Italian etched and gilt piece of the same period. So these pieces of armor that you see in the portrait are as old as the sitter, potentially.
Yeah.
But but pieces like this, they didn't go out of fashion very quickly. They're functional pieces of armor, and they had quite long working lifetimes.
And presumably, were they quite expensive as well? Was that another reason to maybe hold on to them, or?
Not hugely expensive. I mean, they're nicer ones because they have gilt decoration, fire gilt decoration. But by this time, even very crude, low quality Italian armor had etched decoration. The attitude very much was bad decoration is better than no decoration.
Right. And I mean, we think actually that the badge that which is seen in our portraits may actually depict Marcus Curtius. And to give a bit of background to maybe those who don't know about the legend, is that in about 360 BC, a deep chasm opened in the Roman Forum, and prophets declared rather gravely that the pit would not close until Rome's most valuable possession was thrown into it, and claiming that nothing was more valuable to Rome anyway than a brave citizen, Curtius, who's a sort of military figure, I suppose, leapt in fully armed and on horseback into the chasm, which immediately closed. And I suppose the symbolism would be that it's, sacrificial deeds for their country, which is actually really what happened as well to Reinst latterly. So it's maybe a bit prophetic having an object like this, because his term as Governor General of the East Indies was cut very short. Actually, he only served for 18 months before he died of dysentery, as it happened. And some also say that he was hastened to the grave because he learnt that one of his young sons had died en route to join his father in the East Indies. So another feature of this portrait I'd quite like to talk about is the chain, the gold chain that is worn by Reinst. So basically, to help convince Reinst to accept the position, the States General of Holland gave him this expensive gold chain, which is recorded actually, and its value is, I think, 1,000 guilders, and a beautiful honorary medal of the same metal, so they said. And you probably can't see it in the image here. If you go on our website and zoom in, you'll see that it depicts Prince Maurits, who is the Stadtholder of the United Provinces, and really the figurehead of the country. And this medal apparently would have been actively worn during diplomatic meetings with Far Eastern leaders, people such as the Japanese shogun, who took hierarchy very seriously and would only deal with individuals that they saw represented people of equal status to themselves, which in Western cultures was usually the king. But however, the United Provinces was obviously a republic at the time, and they strategically misrepresented Maurits as the King of Holland, so that he could be so that whoever wore this medal would be granted audience to these figureheads. And it was things like this which enabled people like Reinst and all who followed him to create these incredibly important and exclusive trading deals with the Far East, which would facilitate their prosperity, I suppose. And Red, I mean, are any of these whatever he's wearing? Are they things? Well, here we have this French gorget that's in the show.
I mean, you know, not only is he a trader, he's quite keen on depicting himself as a military man, isn't he? I mean, it's very much, what he's wearing is very much a reflection on his wealth, his status, and really his bravery. You know, the decoration that you talk about is, you know, about Marcus Aurelius. You see that on military armor, specifically Saxon comb morions of the latter part of the 16th century. It's decoration that is seen there as well. Yeah, he's definitely keen to be portrayed as an adventurer and brave with it, isn't he?
Absolutely, yeah.
And the French gorget that we see now, which is about 1610 in date, again has a depiction of a mounted warrior. We believe it could actually be King Henry IV of France. And this is a piece of armor that, like in the portrait, will have probably only been worn with maybe even just a buff coat. You know, it's lovely to imagine that there's an armor with, you know, out there somewhere, you know, missing armor that, you know, continues en suite with this decoration. But we truly believe that this is likely, it would have had a back plate to it, the back of the gorget, but this really is, again, just a sort of status symbol. And you see this with gorgets running all the way through into the 18th and 19th century, regimental gorgets. You know, they become smaller, but always depicting, you know, often with a sort of coat of arms or a regimental number. You know, this is something that you see for hundreds of years later.
Right, fascinating. Okay, well, I think we could probably move on to the next portrait, which is painted in the 1660s in England by probably one of the most original and successful native British artists of the time, John Michael Wright, who was basically a direct competitor and contemporary of Sir Peter Lely, who many may have heard of. And the sitter is a chap called Lord Henry Howard, who would later become the 6th Duke of Norfolk. Now, the Howards were probably the most prominent Catholic noble family in Britain during the whole 17th century, really, and they were intimately connected with several generations of the royal family. And Henry's paternal grandfather was Thomas Howard, who's the 14th Earl of Arundel. He was a notable figure in the courts of both James I and Charles I, as well as being one of the major patrons of Rubens and Van Dyck. Henry, during the Civil War, I should say, most of his family were in exile on the continent, and he went there with his grandfather, Thomas Howard, and also his elder brother. So Henry was the younger brother of the family. And sadly, Thomas, the elder brother, he contracted fever whilst they were in Padua, which rendered him a lunatic, unfortunately, and he suffered for the rest of his life. And he was thus unable to fulfill his hereditary legacy and destiny, I should say. So it meant that our sitter, Henry here, became the de facto head of the family when his father, who had been serving in the Civil War, died in 1652. Following the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, which we think is around the time that this portrait was painted, the family fortunes and thus their prospects changed quite dramatically. The House of Lords that year persuaded King Charles II actually to revive the dukedom of Norfolk, which had been defunct for a few generations. And since the heir apparent, Thomas, was consigned to an asylum in Padua at the time, Henry was summoned to the Lords in his own right. And on the death of his elder brother in the 1670s, he assumed the title of sixth Duke of Norfolk. So here, Toby, would you mind sort of discussing the type of armor he's wearing in the first place and of what use it may have had?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting portrait because there's a kind of initial reaction you have from it. And then as you start looking at it, you wonder whether the statement, the visual statement that's being made might not actually be rather more complex than is first apparent. Or it might not. It might be incidental. We're in the 1660s now. Full plate armor hadn't been worn on the battlefields of Europe for a generation at least, and it was now very far away from its golden age of military relevance in the late 15th and first half of the 16th century. So your initial reaction is that of a military statement, that this is someone who wants you to get a very strong impression of him as a military commander. And that's the kind of superficial reaction we have, and it's perfectly understandable. He's got a really nice sword sitting there, it's a back sword. It's a military cavalry sword with the buff leather belts and nice gilded fittings, and he's also wearing a sash, which is a standard accessory of military commanders in the 17th century. So he is making some very clear military statements. And he may think that the armor is doing that for him as well, or he may not. The armor is not an armor for war. It's a jousting armor, or parts of a jousting armor that date from the very early 17th century. This is an armor that was probably made in about 1600, no later than about 1610. And it's a very fine, very nice thing, made in the Greenwich Royal Workshop, a royal court armor workshop founded by Henry VIII in 1515, which had, of course, flowered greatly in the reign of Elizabeth and became famous as one of the greatest centers for the production of fine courtly armor in Europe. And then, of course, in the 17th century, it declined, but it took a long time to do so. And this undecorated, plain, polished Greenwich style was enormously fashionable in the early Stuart period, especially under Charles I. And already at that point, it had kind of an archaic association, that it's meant to invoke the very ancient rights of the aristocracy. You can imagine why Charles I would want to hammer that home.
Sure.
And this undecorated plain style was very much a feature of Stuart courtly display. And this is what this is. This armor could very well have belonged to Lord Howard's grandfather, who was exactly the right age to be taking part in some of the last courtly jousts held in England in the very early 16th century. So if someone wants to suggest, Charlie, that this armor is a reference to his grandfather, it's certainly very much consistent with that message.
Okay, so
just one little note, the meaning of armor is often in the details, the really fine details. And there's a number of ways you can tell this is a jousting armor, but if you look very closely at his left elbow, the elbow closest to us, you can see a little a pierced stud. It's like a little metal stud sticking out of right out of the joint in the elbow. And then he has another one of those pierced studs on the front of the visor, just below the point, just below his hand. And those are the attachment points for the Grand Guard, which was an exchange piece for the joust. We have one of them, a Greenwich one at the Wallace, that's basically what this armor should have had, if we can see that. And also there it is. You can see that the Grand Guard has a hole in the side of the face where it attaches to that helmet in that location. So this Grand Guard might go on Lord Howard's armor quite well, actually.
Sure.
If we go back to the portrait also, just the whole profile of the visor is not for war. It's a jousting visor.
Right.
So then you think to yourself, well, maybe in 1660, Lord Howard had this ancestral armor. It had dynastic significance. It had personal meaning. And he didn't know the ins and outs of war armor versus jousting armor. Why should he in the 1660s? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But he uses this armor to try and make his military statement, suggested by the other objects in the foreground. But then he's got a lance rest on. It's that bracket sticking out of his breastplate.
Right.
And if you look in the background, he has a valet holding his horse, and the valet's got a lance as well, a heavy cavalry lance. So that makes me go back the other way again and think, actually, Lord Howard knows much more about what this armor is and what it represents. And there's actually a number of different key messages here, and he kind of wants you to get multiple messages all at the same time.
Sure.
I think it can also be, to reflect on the grandeur of his family, can't it? I mean, it's often the case, I often get asked as a dealer by other dealers to date armor in portraiture because they think it'll give them a hint as to the date of the painting, but that's often not relevant, is it? And, it's often something, you can be wearing your great-grandfather's armor, 100 years later in a portraiture.
Yeah, and that becomes an increasing phenomenon as armor becomes obsolete on the battlefield, and as tournaments start to disappear, when the armor no longer has immediate contemporary resonance, it takes on this dynastic, anachronistic statement role instead. This would not happen in the early 16th century. At that point, armor is so contemporary, so personal. Wearing grandpa's armor would be unthinkable. But now armor has artistically now expressively a very different role. And certainly in the later 16th, 17th, 18th, even 19th centuries, you continue to see old armors in portraits for all sorts of other reasons, as Red says.
Do you think there's any symbolism to the hand raising the visor like that? Or do you think it's the artist showing off?
Well, these gestures often have some kind of meaning or compositional purpose. They chose to do that. I think it's a way of I think there's a compositional thing where it just kind of frames and unites the picture. It sort of guides your eye around it. Of course, you're initially drawn to the sitter's face. Then that armor gets your attention. Then his hand steers you over to the other side of the picture. You appreciate all the objects that have been arranged for you, and then the posture of the hand and the plumes on the helmet take you up into the back corner where you notice the horse and the lance and everything else.
Into the landscape, and then
they have good control of where your eye goes in what order in this picture, I think.
Yeah, and well, he's obviously wearing with great pride, and I think actually with the landscape, it looks to be sort of a new dawn, perhaps, of reviving the prestige of his family, I suppose, and equally but we think it could be a tomb. The flat steps at the front could be a slightly ajar tomb, which again, I suppose, could relate to a resurrection of sorts.
And the placement of the objects is consistent with that idea too, because arms and armor was frequently placed on the tabletop of funerary monuments.
Right.
And sometimes later 16th and 17th century funerary monuments actually have arms and armor carved in alabaster, but placed on what appears to be the tabletop. It's part of this idea that in death, the knight gives the instruments of his divine power back to God. Yes, it's distinctly funerary, the arrangement of the objects. Notice also he's got the jousting gauntlet for the left hand just behind the sword. That's another nice detail.
And do you think the sash that's tied around his waist, has that got any particular title, meaning towards a title, or?
It's typically just the badge of a military commander.
Okay, well, I think we might move on to the final portrait. Yeah. So this is slightly later than the others. And if you just bear with me 1 second. It's a small scale portrait of the famous, or perhaps infamous, depending on what side you're on, Prince James Edward Stuart, who's better known to most as the Old Pretender. This was painted by Antonio David, who was the official court painter of the exiled Stuarts in Rome in the turn of the 1700s. And it was commissioned by one of the Old Pretender's closest supporters, Sir David Nairn, who was his personal secretary in Rome. For those who don't know, James Edward Stuart was the only son of King James VII and II, who had been deposed from the British throne on account of his conversion to Roman Catholicism during what's known as the Glorious Revolution in 1688. The king and his family first escaped to France, where they were protected by the fellow Catholic monarch Louis XIV. And when his father died in the early 1700s, James was declared James III by the French and also his Catholic supporters on the continent. The other side, i.e. those who supported the Protestant Hanoverian dynasty, who had assumed the throne in Britain, called James and later his son Charles the Pretenders, as they were claimants to the British throne, but they were ineligible on account of their faith to be monarchs in Britain. So James and his supporters attempted to recapture the British throne in 1715 and 1718, but failed both times. His loyal supporters and followers were known as Jacobites, and their name being derived from the Latin for James, which is Jacobus. And they believed that the Catholic descendants of James VII and II, a Stuart, were the rightful heirs to the British throne, and not their foreign, distant, and notably Protestant relatives who had assumed it. So with Jacobites and the goal of reclaiming the throne, I suppose, they needed sort of a figurehead, I suppose. And James III, as we'll call him, I suppose, was an icon of the Jacobite cause and the subject of dozens of artworks during his lifetime. Really, portraiture especially being a very useful and recognizable form of propaganda for such things. David here really is an official portrait painter for the exiled court in Rome. Really, he worked for them for 20 years and also painted James's children, Charles, as I mentioned earlier, who's better known now as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and also Prince Henry, who is later known as Cardinal York. Anyway, so we'll talk about the portrait itself, which is actually right behind me here. You can see his size, but despite the size, he's got a lot of wall power, I'd say. And it was painted at the very beginning of the relationship between the artist and the Old Pretender, which we think is about 1717 or thereabouts. And we can see he's wearing a fashionably high-peaked wig and a highly sheen breastplate. And he's also wearing two noble distinctions: the blue sash of the Order of the Garter, which you see here, which was the most prestigious chivalric order in British nobility, and also you can see rich greens and gold of the Order of the Thistle. And we believe that this portrait actually shows them being worn together for the first time. So, Toby, would you mind describing the type of armor he's wearing for us?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is really interesting because, again, it shows how armor endured as a feature in art long after it was obsolete on the battlefields of Europe. And that I'm a curator in an art museum, and I spend my life talking about how arms and armor is art itself. It's wearable, functional art. That's something that is not necessarily self-evident to a lot of people, because armor is a functional tool. And the modern mind often has trouble with the idea that something can be a practical utilitarian device at the same time as it's a work of art. We usually want things to be one or the other. So this is a wonderful proof of a great many of the expressive power of armor. It was made to have that expressive power in life. And then even after it doesn't need to be worn for warfare anymore, it still retains that presence in art. And armored portraits continue right through the 18th century. And that tradition links up perfectly well with the Gothic revival in the 19th century. And pretty soon you have Victorians, presenting themselves in armored portraits. It never goes away. Very much like the previous picture, this armor is again somewhat older than the sitter. This is an armor that was probably made in about 1620, 1630. It's Dutch, and it was made for heavy cavalry use in the early 17th century. Very finely etched and gilt. You can see that the pauldrons, the shoulder defenses, have very nice picadille edging, probably like a pink velvet, edged with gold bullion, which matches the covering on the straps. This is a very prestigious object that's been kept in very good condition for 100 years by the time the picture is painted. One thing that really reveals it to be the date that it is the arm. You see that 17th century armor for the arms tends to have very small little side wings. You can see that little heart-shaped wing at the side. Those in the 17th century are like this, very small in proportion to the rest of the figure. And you can probably see this better in life, Charlie, but the inner bend in his arm is also protected with a set of articulating steel plates. And that's another standard feature of cuirassier or heavy cavalry armor of the 17th century. If you just compare it with a slightly different one at the Wallace here, no, that's not. Keep going.
Next slide, I think.
Yeah, there we go. This is that's the armor. This is an Italian one in the Wallace collection, dating from the same period as the armor in the portrait was made. And if you go back to the detail of the arm, you can see again a similarly small little wing at the elbow, and those articulating plates for the bend in the arm. This is a different style artistically. This is an Italian Savoyard style, a very rich overall etched and gilt armor. But in its overall constructional form, the armor in the portrait, if we go back to it, is very much of its time in the 1620s, and then these old armors survive for centuries after in portraiture.
Right. And I mean, is there any reason why he's wearing Dutch armor over, say, Italian? Considering
no, not really. Dutch armor became there was a sort of a golden age of armor making in the Netherlands in the very late 16th and early 17th century. It became very fashionable. If you look at the Stuart court of James I and VI, you start to see Dutch armors appearing more at court, being given as gifts to Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales at that time. It's just de rigueur in the early 17th century. And in this case, it's a nice etched and gilt armor that the artist or someone had and provided for the project. I don't think it carries by this date any deeper symbolic importance. It's a nice armor.
But it's also, a reflection of sophistication, isn't it? I mean, Toby, you'll remember this better than I, but is it Pershore Abbey where is there a 15th century effigy? You're right in the middle of England, and there's a 15th century effigy of a knight, and he's wearing Italian armor. Carved Italian armor. It's there. It was big business. It was big trade.
Yeah, I mean the relationship between England or Great Britain and the continent is always a complex one, and sometimes the English want to stress their cultured continental connections, and sometimes they really don't. And it varies over time. I'm a medieval and Renaissance person, so anything after 1600 starts to feel like the distant future.
Same with us, actually.
Maybe a late 17th or 18th century person could tell me what Dutch symbolism there might be, but I may not see it because of a lack of awareness of these far-flung futuristic periods. But I think they would have ceased to see specific symbolism in armor too, because they weren't any longer an armor-wearing culture.
Right. Okay. And Red, this piece that's just come up on screen here, would you mind discussing that a little bit?
Well, in a way, it relates more to your very first portrait. I mean, it's absolutely the sort of breastplate that would have been, same sort of Northern Italian, prolifically made. These were common. And are, if you add in the museum collections, they're common today. I mean, this is a lovely example, and it's in superb condition and not an easy thing to find on the open market. But your business will have owned countless portraits, both 16th and 17th century, of Italian and other nationalities, gentlemen, with just this sort of, wearing just this sort of breastplate, these bands of etched decoration, these double portraits that you see in the roundels at the top. It's very common in portraiture to see this type of, doublet formed breastplate.
It may sound a silly question, but how are the very intricate designs etched? What kind of tools would have been used to make this?
Well, with etching, it's you're essentially using acid. You're corroding away the background leaving the foreground uncorroded. And then in this case, and I'm having to zoom in quickly to remind myself, the background is then gilded. And of course, it's you're chiseling and engraving the surface as well for the more detailed trophies of arms and such like that you see on this breastplate. Okay. So a combination of different techniques.
Okay. Well, I think we finished with the portraiture element of the discussion. So perhaps we'll move on. Toby, would you like to elaborate about your Meet the Expert month at the Wallace and the sort of structure around it?
Sure. Just very briefly. I mean, if people are interested in what we've been talking about and the presence of armor in art and the status of armor as art, that's what we're focusing on at the Wallace this month. We've started a new monthly program of online events and talks and written content online called Meet the Expert. And every month it's a curator or a conservator primarily at the Wallace, and we take over the month and we lead on all of this special content, and we pick a theme that is somehow revealing of our subject area. And one of the biggest ongoing aspects of the subject that I'm interested in is the function of armor as not just decorative art, which it is, of course, but an expressive art form. Armor as a process through which the artist transforms his patron into a living artwork. And how personal is that? And how complex can the messages broadcast to the world through the armor How can we study that in greater detail? How can we learn to understand fully the complex messages that are being sent to us through this art form? So there's going to be a little short talk on YouTube coming out in the next couple of days where I look at an especially rich Italian Renaissance visor and think about the more specific messages that might be contained in it. And then on the 18th, I think it's the 18th of December, 17th of December at 3 o'clock. I'm doing a longer online talk at for the Wallace, really exploring in more detail the whole idea of armor as a Renaissance art form. Check us out. I mean, obviously, I'm on Instagram. The Wallace is on Instagram. The Wallace, all the usual information outlets. The Wallace website has got my special content on it for the month, which is looking pretty nice. And that's the next step if all of this interests you from where I'm working on it anyway.
So for those who want to sort of register for your talks, do they just go on YouTube or do they go to the Wallace website to register?
Well, yeah, the short talk is on YouTube and you can just see that whenever you like. The long talk, it's live on Zoom, so I expect you need to register and get a code or whatever.
Much like today.
That'll be on the Wallace's website.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I think we have a little bit of time for a Q&A session if we have any questions. So feel free to tap the button at the bottom of Zoom rather, and we shall wait a few moments to see if we have any coming in.
Does anybody want to unmute and just ask it verbally, or you can punch it into the Q&A board there?
I think you have to type it in, unfortunately. So
maybe we've covered it exhaustively.
Maybe we have. Oh, here we go. Actually, we have one question here from Deborah. Wondering, are there any portraits of women in armor? At the top of my head, I cannot think of any actually from 16th and 17th century, other than those that maybe are actually, rather than portraits, maybe representing historical figures. And the like.
I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head because, again, it's the distant future of the 17th and 18th centuries, but I do recall that sometimes you get female sitters in portraits where they are taking on the guise of Minerva or Athena or Britannia. Yeah. And in those guises, they wear stylized armor of one sort or another. But that's really a fanciful costume. Women never really wore armor practically in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, with, of course, the notable exception of Joan of Arc, who really did wear armor, and we have the receipts in the royal accounts of the King of France who paid for her armor, and we know a fair amount about the armor that she had, but she is the marked exception. Otherwise, women wearing armor is considered cross-dressing. Which is one of the worst things you can do in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. And in fact, that was the worst thing that her prosecutors could think to accuse Joan of Arc of at her trial. Much worse than being a witch was wearing male clothing, really? Which includes armor. Right. So there are depictions in medieval and Renaissance manuscripts of women wearing armor, but they are in a classical or legendary context. Amazons and so forth. In the 16th century, you of course also get the epic Italian poem Orlando Furioso, which is the runaway bestseller in Renaissance Europe. And that is a really extraordinary work. It's fast becoming my favorite ever work of literature. And it's the sort of book that when you finish it, you just want to start from the beginning again. But in that, written by Ludovico Ariosto, who was a poet in the patronage of Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, he has a number of female knights in the book, knights errant who are women of great prowess. And that's, so it's not unheard of in the literature and the culture, but almost unheard of in reality.
Right, okay. I've got another interesting question here. Was from Penelope, was the choice of country of origin of an armor like choosing a Bentley over Ferrari?
Good one.
Yeah, what do you think? I mean, I suppose you were saying earlier about Henry VIII's choice of Flemish armor,
Yes.
for example.
Yes, I think significance in the origin or make of the armor in art is more likely in an earlier period than a later period.
Okay.
As I think the contemporary resonance and significance of that is stronger when the armor is actively being used and is a contemporary part of the technological and artistic culture. So in the 15th century, when you see someone in England wearing Italian armor, it says something very specific. And it's a contrast to his contemporaries who have themselves depicted in English armor.
Okay.
And generally, yeah, then the style of the armor, especially when it's a foreign style, then it has undoubtedly some significance. And I think that the significance is still there into the 16th and perhaps early 17th century. But as people forget about armor as a working, living thing, those specific associations fall away, and what you're left with is the very general military and chivalric messages.
Okay, good. I think we'll do one final question, which maybe I'll direct to Red. So Toby, you could close your ears. But other than the Wallace Collection, which obviously has the best collection of arms and armor, would you recommend any other museums abroad which have a particularly strong holding for arms and armor?
Well, Dresden and the Kunsthistorische in Vienna, and of course the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But and then you have, the Royal Collection up in Leeds. There are multiple wonderful places to visit, often in historic buildings themselves, and yeah. But the Wallace is no slouch. It's epic. It's a very unique, very special place, with such a sort of combination of different art forms. It's definitely one of the favorites.
Great. And Toby, do you have any other personal favorites yourself, or?
Yeah, I mean, the closest I have ever gotten to a transcendental religious experience was at the Royal Armory in Madrid.
Okay. Oh yeah.
Which is really is the perfect complement to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, because both of those collections derive from the Habsburg personal armories. So you kind of have to keep them both in your head at the same time. You go to Vienna and then go to Madrid, and then you've got the complete Habsburg Renaissance experience. There are also some smaller collections beyond the sort of top 10 or top 20 that are worth seeing.
Even Gratz, which isn't exactly flashy.
Yes. Yeah, and
I've got to go, gents.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Fred.
Okay.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much for organising it.
Pleasure, and thank you everyone for joining today. I believe there's one more talk for London Art Week, which is tomorrow, and there are more details on the website. So if you'd like to sign up to that, I think there's still time for that. But otherwise, thank you very much again for joining. And please do check out our website if you can online. And if you'd like to make an appointment, do get in touch. So thanks very much.